Okay, so hopefully you've already watched the intro video for the whole Beowulf and Gawain course. This next video will be a short introduction to Beowulf in particular, to give you a little bit of background on the poem and a few things to look for as you begin reading a very strange and confusing story. So first, a couple quick facts about Beowulf the poem. We don't know who wrote it. It's an anonymous author. So in this class, we'll just refer to the author as the Beowulf author. We also don't really know when Beowulf was written. There's a pretty wide range that scholars say for the time in which Beowulf might have been written. Some people say it was written as early as 650 AD to as late as 1000 AD. That's a really long range of time. That's as if we said we didn't really know when Star Wars, the original movie, came out, whether it was the 1970s or when the Pilgrims landed in America. It's just a really long time frame. So we don't really know when the Beowulf author wrote this poem in the Middle Ages. But what we do know is that whenever the story was written in the Middle Ages, the Beowulf author is telling a story that goes much further back in time than when the poem was written. So even though Beowulf feels old to us, we have to remember that the story felt old to the guy writing it too. There's this sense when you read the poem that we are looking into this distant past, but as we're looking into this distant, shadowy past, the Beowulf author himself is also looking into an even more shadowy past behind him. So if this story feels murky and foggy around the edges, I think that's actually kind of the point of what the author is going for. One other cool fact about Beowulf is that there is only one manuscript of this poem. It's in a museum in the British Isles. When you think about other famous old books like the Bible, we have thousands of manuscripts of the Bible. Some of them are as small as a scrap of paper or the length of a book, but we have thousands of manuscripts of these old texts like the Bible. Beowulf, there's only one, which makes you realize if that one copy had been lost or destroyed, we literally would not even know that Beowulf existed today. Thankfully, we still have that one copy so that you and I can read one of the greatest stories written in the English language. There's a great website called Electronic Beowulf that I highly recommend, and I'll put a link to it on our class page. But Electronic Beowulf has full high-resolution scans of every page of the Beowulf manuscript, so you can literally see the only copy we have of the book that we're reading together. It's written on animal skin, which is also pretty cool to think about. There are some spots in the manuscript where there's a hole on the page, and so the scribe writes around the hole. And it's not like the page got damaged, it's like there was actually a hole in the animal skin right there. So yeah, Beowulf, one manuscript, I think that's pretty cool. Another thing to keep in mind when you're reading Beowulf is that it was written in Old English. So much time has passed between Old English and our contemporary English. And the English language has evolved and changed so much that if you were to look at a page of Beowulf in Old English, it would be almost entirely inscrutable for you. It would be like reading a foreign language. So the Beowulf you're reading, even though it's in English, is not the original Old English of the poem, but there are still some features of Old English that most translators try to find a way to import into their modern English translation of the poem. So hopefully your edition of Beowulf retains some of the flavor and features of Old English poetry that we can talk about a little bit more in class. Okay, so when you're starting Beowulf, the writing itself can be kind of confusing, so I want to give you a plot synopsis so you kind of have a sense for the story, so you don't feel too lost as you're trying to read this book. The first thing to know about Beowulf is that it's a poem written in English in England, but the story is not about English people or England, at least not directly. The main character Beowulf is from the land of the Geats, which was somewhere in what is now southern Sweden. He makes a trip to the land of the Danes to help Hrothgar, king of the Danes, with a monster problem he's having. There's this monster named Grendel who has been terrorizing the Great Hall, and no one's been able to stop this monster until Beowulf shows up. The poem basically has three main sections, and each section is a fight between Beowulf and a monster. The first section is Beowulf versus Grendel, the second section is Beowulf versus Grendel's mother, and the third and last section is Beowulf versus a dragon. In his famous lecture, The Monsters and the Critics, J.R.R. Tolkien points out that this is actually a pretty weird structure for a great work of literature. If you think of other famous great books like Virgil's Aeneid, the monsters in those stories are kind of a sideshow. They're on the edges of the world and the edges of the story. They're not main characters and they don't drive the plot forward. Beowulf is kind of the opposite. The monsters are the main event. They are some of the main characters and they drive the plot forward. A lot of critics before Tolkien took that as a reason to not take Beowulf seriously as a story. They said, why should we care about this book? It's just about a couple of monsters. But Tolkien came forward and said, no, the monsters are the point. There's a lot here in this poem if we take the monsters seriously. So with that synopsis, as you begin this poem and read the first section in this week's reading, here are a couple of things for you to look for in particular. First, pay attention to the introduction of Grendel the monster. I think his introduction and his backstory that the author gives in his introduction is really, really important. So pay attention to who Grendel is and where Grendel comes from. For the second thing to look for when you're reading this first part of the book, remember that the Beowulf author is trying to find a way to juggle or balance his pre-Christian Germanic pagan heritage and his new Latin Christian tradition. So as you're reading this part of the book, see if you can spot anything that feels pagan to you and see if you can spot anything that feels Christian to you. And I'll be very curious when we meet to hear what kinds of things you spotted in this week's reading. The last thing to look for in this first part of the book are any clues about the character of Beowulf. What kinds of character traits do you notice about Beowulf? What kind of person does he seem to be to you? Do you think that the author presents him in a positive light or a negative light? And do you find yourself drawn to Beowulf's values, or do they feel off-putting to you? I'd be very curious to hear what your first take is of Beowulf as a character when you meet him in the story this week. Okay, so that's a little bit of background and some plot synopsis and a couple of things to look for in Beowulf. Hopefully that will help give you a couple of things to hold on to as you start this text. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the class message board and bring them to our class discussion. That should be it for now. Thanks, and I'm really looking forward to meeting you or reconnecting with you in our first class. Thanks.